Hello, and welcome to our event today with Daniel Wallace. My name's Louisa Smith, and I'm the buying director for Book Passage Bookstore and the very lucky host for today's event. I'd first like to thank all of you for tuning in. We know you have lots of options for online events these days, and we so appreciate your support for Book Passage and our favorite authors by choosing to spend your time with us. Book Passage has a robust speaker series with events both in-store and online. I hope you will have a moment today after our conversation to take a look at the calendar on our website and find out about all the exciting events we have coming up. Book Passage is able to offer these events in no small part due to the support of our customers both near and far. So thank you again. Today, we are thrilled to have one of our all-time favorite authors, Daniel Wallace. Daniel is the author of 6 novels, including Big Fish, Ray in Reverse, The Watermelon King, Mr. Sebastian, the Negro Magician, The Kings and Queens of Rome, and Extraordinary Adventures. His novels have been translated into over 36 languages, and his essays and interviews have been published in The Bitter Southerner, Garden and Gun, Poets and Writers, and Our State magazine, where he was, for a short time, the barbecue critic. His short stories have appeared in over 50 magazines and periodicals, and in 2019, he was awarded the Harper Lee Award, given to a nationally recognized Alabama writer who has made significant lifelong contributions to Alabama letters. And he was inducted to the Alabama Literary Hall of Fame in 2022. When he isn't busy writing, Daniel is the J. Ross McDonald Distinguished Professor of English at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Daniel's most recent work, and the reason we are lucky enough to have him here today, is his most personal work yet. This Isn't Going to End Well examines Daniel's deep connection to illustrator and outdoor adventurer William Neely, who is also the author's brother-in-law and an intimate friend and mentor. As Daniel himself states, this is a book about the life and death of William Neely, my brother-in-law, a man I loved and admired, and who left this world by choice when he was 48 years old. A bold and compassionate exploration of male friendship and the devastating impact of suicide. It is part love story, part true crime, part a desperate search for self, and how little we really can know another. This Isn't Going to End Well tells an intimate and moving story of what happens when we realize our heroes are human. With Daniel today is beloved local writer and spiritual coach, Neal Allen. Neal's book, Better Days, Tame Your Inner Critic, is due out in December from Namaste Publishing, and his previous work, Shapes of Truth, Discover God Inside You, was released in 2021. Neal's central work revolves around removing obstacles of the ego. Neal holds a master's degree in political science from Columbia University and Eastern Classics from St. John's College. Now, one of the best parts of these online conversations is your ability to take part in them. So if you have any questions for either Daniel or Neal, just put them in the chat, and hopefully there will be time to answer as many as possible. There will also be a link in the chat if you are interested in learning more about or purchasing our guest books. And with that, I would love to turn this over to our 2 authors today. Welcome, Daniel and Neal.
Thank you, Louisa.
More about or purchasing our guest books.
Hey, Neal, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Daniel?
Doing really well. Here in North Carolina.
And I'm here in Marin County. And why don't we start with, good place to start is for you to just read a little bit and we'll start talking about William and you. Why don't we start with, yeah, I hear it too. Read a little bit and we'll start talking about.
It might have been me. Yeah, it was me. I don't know how that happened.
There's the mysterious echo.
I was complaining about it, and it was always my fault. That happens so often. So, yeah, Neal, I'm going to start just with a really quick overview of the book, and definitely an incomplete one. But this book is about William Neely, who was my sister's boyfriend for 30 years, and they got married way into their relationship. It was something they never really wanted to do, but eventually did. I knew him since I was 12 years old, and the life that swirled around him, I was a part of, sometimes intimately, sometimes from a distance, but he was really, I think, as I wrote this memoir, I realized he was the reason that I became a writer. He showed me ways to be in the world that I never knew were possible. He was initially just cool. That was the attraction. But as we grew up together, he started to become an artist, a cartoonist. He was a kind of a MacGyver character. He could fix anything. He took care of my sister who had rheumatoid arthritis for decades, and was did seem to be that kind of person who anything that he put his mind to, he could do. And I want to just read a short passage at this time from the book, which is a bio he wrote. And often when a writer publishes a book or an article, the editor asked for a bio. And in his papers, I found one that he wrote, which he hand wrote, which he did everything by hand. And it's semi tongue in cheek, but at the same time, actually very, very close to the truth. So here, I'm going to read the entirety of this bio. Neely has been a Boy Scout, an underground cartoonist, high school dropout, war register, civil rights activist, construction worker, college student, BA 1976, mountain rescue specialist, garbage man, professional rock musician, drummer, police analyst, sculptor, spelunker, motorcyclist, bow hunter, paramedic, canoeist, kayaker, river guide, forklift driver, parachutist, author, 10 books translated into 3 languages, real estate photographer, yachtsman, sport angler, traditional archer, rollerblader, tree surgeon, environmental activist, and occasionally a drunk and drug addict. Plus a few other things we can't mention till the statute of limitations runs out. Also a political cartoonist, illustrator, private detective, 2 arrests, 1 conviction, 1 pending, lifeguard, etc., etc. I've done more crazy ass stuff than any other cartoonist on the fucking planet, period. And I still have enough brain cells to write books about my exploits. So as braggadocious as that might sound, as we say in Alabama, no brag, just fact. These things were William and were inspirational to me from the time I was 12. I'm going to read from the very beginning of the book, which is the very beginning of my life with William. So this is what the reader will come to when they come to the book. The boy who couldn't fly. The first time I saw him, he was standing on the roof of our house, wearing frayed and faded cutoffs and nothing else, eyeing the swimming pool about 25 feet below. William, last name unknown, unnecessary. Already, in my mind at least, he had achieved the single name status of a rock star, and I had yet to even meet him. I'd only heard about him from Holly, my sister, who was older than me by 6 years. My sister's boyfriend was on the roof. It was unclear why he was there at first, though he did have the look of someone about to take a leap. But that was impossible. The pool was on the ground, and he was on the roof of the house. Out of utmost concern for any potential accidents, my mother had had the diving board removed, and that had been just 3 feet above the water. He was 8 times higher than that. He had thick, corn yellow hair tied back into a ponytail, broad shoulders, was thin at the waist, and he stood spotlighted by the sun. I thought, holy cow, he is about to jump. I was 12. Until that day, I never thought of a roof as a thing an actual person might, on purpose, jump off of. To get there, he'd first had to stand on the back porch railing and then balance on a window sash, lift himself up over the gutter and roll away from the edge. After that, it was a simple 40-degree angle walk, barefoot on hot shingles to the other side of the house, where the roof flattened out, the roof over my mother and father's bedroom. So He was standing at the edge of my parents' bedroom, surveying his flight path into the water. I guessed it could be done. It looked like it could be done. With a little lift, he would miss the concrete skirt and splash into the deep end. He must have been considering a few of these ways that the jump could go wrong. Or maybe it wasn't William who was considering these things. Maybe it was just me. And now he took 3 steps back away from the edge of the roof for the running start, the bold approach, the liftoff. In my memory, this happened in slow motion. Maybe it actually was in slow motion. Maybe he was that good. And then he was airborne. He hit the water, of course, made a giant splash and disappeared beneath the wake, but not for too long, but long enough for me to wonder if he would ever come up. Then he surfaced, leaning back his head to let the water pull his hair away from his face. Then he got out of the pool, climbed the house, and did it again and again. It was pretty magnificent. I was spellbound. It wasn't some unformed idea I had about masculinity or manliness in him that I was drawn to. I wasn't into that then or now. It was just the wildness, the daring do, his willingness to take flight, literally, into the unknown, an openness to experience and chance that so far in my short life had not been previously modeled to me by anyone. Whatever I was, he wasn't that, and I wasn't sure how much I wanted to be the me I was. That's what I would learn from him, though, over the years, how to become the me I wanted, not by being him, but by watching him. Later, though, much later, I wondered how the rest of our lives would have turned out had he died that day instead of the day he did by his own hand 3 decades later, had he tried for the water but missed.
Your writing is beautiful, and you hear from that passage a voice that continues throughout the book, which is the voice of you coming through. And this is a dual memoir. It's not just a memoir of William, it's a coming of age memoir of your own. Coming of age, it starts when you're 12, typical, good place to start a coming of age memoir. And it continues right just short of your feeling comfortable coming into the adulthood of having an identity as a writer, just short of that. We don't get to quite see you jump over into it, but it's close. So it's kind of all there. And we get to see inside your mind, but we don't get to see inside William's mind. And I want to ask you, as a fiction writer, how difficult that was for you to refrain from offering theories and pat motivations. I mean, you nod to all the possibilities, and so the reader knows that you're aware of the cultural tropes and motivations we would see in the story of William's life, but you stay clear of telling us what's inside, at least for the first half of the book, obviously, what's in William's mind and what's motivating him. I would assume when you're writing your novels, you have a pretty good idea of the backstories and what's motivating a good number of your characters. What was it like to restrain yourself that way?
It's a great question, because this is the first and probably last memoir I'll ever write. I had no idea how it was done. But as I wrote it, I mean, two things. One, I learned that a memoir is a true story written by an unreliable narrator, because memory is completely unreliable and is in a way fictitious. You do the best that you can. But the other thing that I discovered was that these people that you loved, the people that you knew, some of them better than anyone, at any rate, as real as anybody else. Over the course of the years that I was writing the book, they became characters. That is, they became as if they were characters in a book. I was trying to write a story about them, a story that obviously I was incredibly engaged in, but the end, I'm writing it for you. I'm writing it for the reader. And so I had to create a narrative that was compelling. Part of this is this sense of discovery that you have as a writer in a novel. Uh, you know, actually, I don't know what's going on in my novels until I write it down. I don't know who these people are. It's a process of discovery, and it's the same in this book. There was this process of discovering who William was and who I was. In my work, I've always felt like we don't learn about a character through what they think, but what they do. We have thoughts as all the time that we don't act on. It's the ones that we act on that are really the ones that describe us, who, how we learn who we are. So as I investigated my past, which I'd never really done before, I saw through William's actions who he was, at least the William that we're initially introduced to, which is a half of him, or the part of the dual personality which he was.
He was he's presented as it's presented as that while he is larger than life to you and admirable and deserves to be imitated, and you want to live his way and you take on some of his attributes as a mentor, and you as a protege, you're a reluctant protege, and so there's something in you that's also kind of keeping pretty close hold of yourself while all of that is going on. And it's always the problem with mentors. And I maybe this is a good time to interject that I knew William as my best friend when I was 17 and he was 20, and so in a much more limited way, but a very important way in my life, he had the role of mentor. I admired him, looked up to him, and in fact, some of the ways that he lived, I kept as a kind of monitor to me to make sure I was at least dabbling in the kind of freedom that he and Holly, your sister, had.
Mm-hmm.
They had an unusually free way of living in many, many ways, which we can describe. But at some point, you have to get rid of a mentor. And at some point you have to stand fully 2 feet, because mentors are like dads. You have to break from them. And I
Mm-hmm.
think you and I probably had a similar experience that our dads didn't really provide us with the right kind of root. And
Right.
William was, even though he was more a peer than a dad, he was providing us with a root, with a
Yeah.
with an interesting route. He was, I'm not sure it's quite clear, but he was absolutely ironic and absolutely countercultural. And so anything that was kind of a straight middle American path was just not in the, it wasn't an option.
No,
And
it wasn't an option at all.
and he didn't really have people in his life. I always felt like I was like a, 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 a I didn't know his friends. I only visited him occasionally, but I felt like I was his straight friend or something like that, later in life. Um, when did you recognize that you had broken with him enough to be able to be objective about him?
Having a mentor, is it's being a mentor is like having a stalker.
Yeah.
William did not know he was my mentor. is not anything we ever talked about. And my dad knew he was my dad, obviously, and he was providing me with the things that he could. And the path in life that he saw was the best one for me. It wasn't the best one. And I didn't realize that until William was in my life. And I think there's so many of us, and it's kind of, I mean, it's very sad, obviously, that we don't know who we can be. We don't have any experience or have anybody to model this alternate person. And then, we're just led down the path that we've been presented with because we don't have any knowledge of any other way to go. William did all these things that I read about earlier, and as I knew that I could not be that guy, but there were elements that I could take from him and absorb, sponge-like, and convert into my version of them. And for instance, he was obviously an avid boater, kayaker. He is iconic in that world to this day, and he's been dead for over 20 years, and his last kayaking book was published 40 years ago, but people still look at his maps, people still read his books. He was kayaking every opportunity he could. He had a kayak, of course, on the roof of his van all the time in case he was driving somewhere where the river was high. How many times did I go kayaking with him? None. Never. I never went out on a river. Didn't want that. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to put on gear. I didn't want to put on the wetsuit, carry the kayak around with me. I do think one reason that I became a writer was the gear was really minimal. I mean, you got it. Really, all you really needed is a pencil and a piece of paper. Exactly. You got it. You're an expert now. You've got the pencil. You've got the paper. So he, however, becoming a writer is really a risky thing to do. And I did feel like that this choice I made to become a writer, it put me in the same world where William was. He published 10 books that were drawn from, for the most part, from his experience on the river. When did I become the me that I am? And I think at that point is when you start to drift away from the mentor and they go in their direction and you lose sight of them. And as you said, it's as it should be. You can't go through your life attached to this person who was responsible for making you. It is exactly like a parent.
Yeah, I love that. And I had the same experience of I knew I was a stalker, and I knew he couldn't know that.
Yes, exactly.
A great metaphor for it. Why don't you show us a little bit of the uh, public genius of William, and
Right.
what made him kind of a famous in certain outdoors communities.
Yeah. So he did something that had never been done before and hasn't been done since, which is drawing these hand-drawn maps of every river in the Southeast that were once at the same time collectible, but they're also accurate. You could know where to get out of the river to make sure that the next run was going to be safe. He was funny, and this is a thing that I think some people don't understand, people who didn't know him, how funny he was. Darkly funny, yes, but his cartooning was reflected in the way he designed his maps. There were always these little characters that went along with the map that made it unique. And I've got it actually. I've got a one here. So this looks like it's been blown up. This is not. This is the actual size of the map that he drew. So it's about, I guess, about 3 feet high. And if you, it's hard to see, I know, where you are, but you can see the detail that he did by hand for every single river in the Southeast, and some out your way. I can't remember which rivers he did out there. Is there an American river out that way?
Yeah. There are different parts to it, and and the Yuba River near it.
Yeah. So these took a very long time to draw, and when the deadline was approaching, Holly would, and this is not a metaphor, this is true, would chain him to his drafting table. So his foot was actually chained, and he couldn't leave when the river went up. There's always a good reason. As a writer, there's always a good reason not to write. I've got to clean the kitchen. That I would love to write, but I've got to do this. He would always have a river to run, but he would be attached to the drafting table, so he couldn't go. And there's a picture of him, or a drawing of him, in one of his books, of him attached to his drawing table. I could read a little from the book a little bit about his maps, and what made him.
I wanted to mention one thing, which is he did not just the rivers, but he did other kind of very physical sports that some people would at the time have called extreme sports, like mountain biking at first was an extreme sport. And
Right.
And it's interesting because I think people have an odd idea that extreme sports are something about risking your life and adrenaline, when they're really about getting things going so fast that you have to rely on something more than simple computation, mental computation, and being able to be released into the support of the world. It's kind of like John Coltrane doing his getting to play so fast he could no longer control his fingers. And that there's actually something about mapping a river is providing other people with the opportunity to avoid risk while being able to fly through the river at great speed and with smoothness, and be able to expend little energy while you're a little more safe and going really fast.
Yes, I mean that the experience that he had kayaking, not dissimilar from the experience that a writer has when he's into the story. When and I'm sure you've had this experience, you look up and 2 hours have gone by. You haven't been thinking, you've just been doing. And that's what happens when you're engaged in these sports. It's this combination of knowledge and but no recklessness. It's this engaged. You would think, or one might think, that because he ended his own life, that he was much more susceptible or much more eager to be in these dangerous situations. But William was never ever going to die on the river.
Yeah.
He was too good. He would never allow that to happen. He was in control. If he was going to die, he was going to be the one to do it. And he writes about that. Writes about how how hard it is to separate yourself from everything and just be, just be in that moment. And I think with his the sports that he was engaged in, it allowed him a vacation from himself. This otherwise he was always drawn back into what was happening in here.
So we haven't talked about what was happening in here yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I interrupted. Do you want to?
No. So he loved to make lists, and one of his lists in the late 70s was decide what I will be: adventurer, cartoonist, artist, writer. That was the first thing on his list. And by the 80s, I'll read from it now. By the 80s, he was exactly that. He was an artist, a cartoonist, an adventurer. He was a writer, even a cartographer. This was his special gift. He drew meticulous, cartoon-laden river maps that pointed out problematic rapids and things you might see along the shoreline and how you might feel at every juncture. Looking at one, you felt as if he'd memorized every rock, rapid, and eddy. Later, his creations would expand to include rock climbing, mountain biking, skiing, even inline skating. His playful, edgy style finally found its natural genre, a genre that didn't exist before he created it. And it's a genre that hasn't been copied by anybody. It's so good.
Yeah. So he found freedom and intimacy with the natural world and with playing in nature. And his first, in his description, in his self-written bio, the first term is Boy Scout, and you point out in the book that in many ways he never stopped being a Boy Scout in quite literal ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what he was about, figuring out how to survive outside. He did when he was with me at St. John's. He was he joined the Northern New Mexico Search and Rescue Team. Was there? It was interestingly led by a guy named Herb Kinsey, wonderful guy. I didn't know him personally, but William did, who had that thing that people who are in paramedics and search and rescue, and also people who do outdoors, there's a sincerity that they have, and a sincerity like what you would want out of a Boy Scout leader, right? And I always thought Herb was kind of like that, the Boy Scout leader that William really looked up to Herb, like you would look up to a Boy Scout leader. But they were adults and they knew that, but there was still, that was not allowed to rest for William, and it provided him with a great deal, clearly, of his happiness. The social world of human beings, he wasn't so happy with, and it was, and so there are the book reads, your book wonderfully reads, is structured in many ways like a novel. You said there are characters like novels, and that's true. And there is a halfway point where there's this incredible twist. And then there's at least one, maybe two more substantial twists afterward that are kind of, and it was a shocking twist. And you told me it was okay to mention it.
Yes. I think it's essential to mention it because this book would never have been written had this not happened. So William died by suicide in 2001, and Holly, his wife, and my sister lived for another 10 years. And when she died, we were going through her place, cleaning it out, giving out things that she loved, family members, and that sort of thing. And in the back of a closet, we found William's journals, his private journals. And my sister, Rangeley, was there, my wife, Laura, my little sister, Barry. And we looked at this box and looked at each other. And I think Rangeley said, we just should throw these away. It's not our business. And we don't really have permission to do this. So we kind of all agreed that this was not for us, and so I took the journals out to the dumpster where we were putting everything, and I put the journals in my trunk of my car because I didn't feel like that these were things that should just be tossed away. He was a great writer. He was an artist. So anyway, I put them in my car. I took them home, put them in a bookcase, and didn't look at them for 2.5 years. But they were in a hallway outside of my office, and I always saw them when I went in, and I looked at them really longingly, and I felt that they were looking at me the same way. I felt this like tapping on the glass, but I was struggling with this moral quandary, really, because I think that a case could be made that this wasn't my business and that I shouldn't look at them. But finally, I did. And what I discovered was this second William, this alternate William, or this presence of this a situation, a Jekyll and Hyde situation, where both of them were conscious and knowing of the other. The William that we've been talking about for the most part so far was that the William all of us would meet if we knew him, met him socially. The part of him that was described in the journals was so far away from that that it did constitute sort of a second life, and that he kept hidden from all of us, and to a large degree even from Holly, who he knew all of his life.
And this person had self-hatred.
Yeah, he did. He did not see a place for him in the world. He was insecure. He didn't believe that his art was valuable. Everything that we saw in him that was valuable, he derided, and he had suicidal ideation from at least from when he was 25. That's when the first journal that I have is from when he was 25, and it may have been actually his first journal the way it starts out. But all through his life, there are passages where he talks about really every day making the decision to live. We talk about that metaphorically, but it's actually a choice that he made. And I think people who do take their lives, there's this balance that occurs. They're moving back and forth between reasons to live and reasons not to. And he was able to live for almost 25 years longer with this compelling desire not to live. And I think, that was because he was taking care of my sister, and he wanted somehow to give her a life. He wanted to cure her in some way, even though rheumatoid arthritis at the time was not curable. He wanted what he called an immortality project, and she was his first, and she was the reason he was able to stay alive for as long as he did.
She was one of the, I probably met her a total of a half dozen times. She was one of the favorite people in my life. I mean,
Yeah,
she was remarkable. So, and the remarkability is kind of curious, knowing that here William was carrying this complete secret, and presumably, I think you just said, keeping a lot of it secret from Holly. And Holly was possibly the single most open person I have ever met. I mean, she at least the Holly I saw, she she you couldn't offend her. You couldn't say anything to her that would surprise her. You couldn't she just really enjoyed being a human and being around humans. And
Yeah.
she took humans however they came to her. And I'm not saying she didn't have judgment, and I'm not saying she couldn't make fun of people, and I'm not saying any of that, but she was open. She was as open as you can get. And William Audley was about as big a secret as anybody could. And one other thing, which is to mention, you point out in the book, he's really rational about his secret in the sense that he describes it. He's making opposing lists. He's saying, this is what I'm balancing. Here are the components into what's that. Now, there's no sign, I gather, that he has looked for original causes or cures beyond, kind of obvious stuff. But maybe I'm wrong about that.
He was brilliant. He was a polymath. He read hundreds and hundreds of books a year. He was scientific. He did not read that many novels, but he read history, he read science, and so that was not lost when he was writing about himself. He's very, very, aware of the situation that he was in. There's a part in one of his journals where he writes this sentence in all caps, and it's the only place in all of the journals that he does this. And he says, I must not let them see who I really am.
Chilling.
It is chilling. It is chilling. And he says they couldn't handle it. They couldn't handle the real me, which is, a person who really can't handle themselves. We could have handled them easily, but he was afraid of not being loved because of the person that he had created, which we did love.
Yeah. I was terrified, to open this book because I was so scared that I would object and I
Yeah.
didn't know where it was going to go or whatever. And I have to tell you, William has been alive in me for a couple months now since I read the book, and I've loved William being alive in me, and I've
Yeah.
loved being able to go back and see him again. But when part two of the book begins, the journals, there's a decline that
Mhm.
also you describe his later years, and he gets distant and he gets obsessions and things. And I saw that happen also from a lot more distance than you did, right? Just from an occasional visit. He seemed to withdraw slowly
Yeah.
also.
Yeah. And as you said, I guess maybe one of the last visits that you had, you barely saw him at all and just hung out with Holly.
Yeah. Yeah. He was not receiving visitors, kind of. That was
Yeah.
the message. And I because I had always been assumed I was smaller and he was bigger, I of course read into it that he was dismissive of me, and it didn't matter to me because he had accepted me enough to
Yeah.
invite me into his home, even if he wasn't going to spend any time with me. But he was, now I know from reading that he was hollowing himself out, kind of.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. He had, what year was it that you were there when you saw him? Do you know?
He, well, it was sometime in the last time would have been sometime in the 90s.
Right.
So, but earlier 90s, not later. I don't think I think it had been close to 10 years probably when he killed
Mhm.
himself. Yeah.
Well, but first of all, I understand your fear in coming to this book to read about somebody who you knew as well, right? I mean, we all have this experience of these other people in our life which are specific to us. And my experience is not your experience. I mean, by definition, there are ways that it intersects. But the fear in publishing a book like this is that people are going to read it and say, this is not accurate. This is not true. You know.
You brought him alive, I promise you. I thought I knew him, and that one
Yeah.
that one you brought alive. What did you? I think everybody wants you to answer the question. How do you hold William's suicide?
How what?
How do you hold William's suicide? How do you think about it? How do you not resolve it, but how do you
Mm.
keep it with you
Right.
and not run away?
So you mentioned the service that we had in Birmingham when I read when I talked about how much I loved William and how um, I would have put a bumper sticker on my car. What would William do? Because that's the way I thought, and a lot of people thought that way. I wasn't the only one that had him as a mentor or that thought he was bigger than life. Lots of people did, and so this was very obviously very soon after he took his life, and but as I saw Holly deteriorate so severely after he died, because he literally was her other half, and he gave her a life that she wouldn't have had. So she was falling apart, and as I watched her fall apart, I started to really despise him. I more than anybody that I ever have, uh, because of the consequences of his suicide. And anybody who's had this experience knows how infinite the number of the ripples that the suicide caused. But I judged him um, as cowardly for abandoning my sister. Then I read the journals. It wasn't until after that that I read the journals. And as I did, and as I understood the battle, his really incredibly brave battle with life and death, I started to think of him as one of the most courageous people that I've ever known, that he could sustain himself over the course of so many years. I came to believe that that there was an inevitability about this, about him taking his own life. And so by the time that I uh, wrote this book, really, by the time that I was investigating his life through reading the journals and writing the book, um, I did come to um, this peace, and definitely not closure, because I don't think closure is a thing that you really want in an experience like this. You don't want, and you can't do it. There's no way of closing it, but you want to open up. You want to open your mind and your vision. You want to make it bigger. And that's what happened in writing this book. So I carry it with me um, all the time. It's our lives have changed. My family's life has changed to this day, and nephews, grandchildren are different now, even those who barely knew him. Uh, but um, but I do hold him in the highest regard. What about you? What did you think?
I was so far away that I couldn't go through. I remember Holly pulled me, and she was so frail, and in the wake, and we were really loaded. Everybody was really loaded, and Holly pulled me onto her lap and just kept saying, "Neal, why?" Over and over and over again. And I realized, you know, I didn't know. I had no idea. And I also didn't know what he had tried to rescue himself. Presumably he tried to rescue himself at some point in his life, right? And I didn't know what had been offered him. I knew he had antidepressants for depression,
Yeah.
and so he was looking at helping himself, but I just didn't know. And so in a way, his suicide also came in the middle of, I lost three men who had been my best friend at some time in my life in the space of 5 years, and his was the second one. And they, they were all very young. And you've experienced that because you lost him, you lost Holly. Now the book is dedicated to a close friend who died before he got to old age, also, of yours. And so, it becomes more about death and more about how do we live without these people in our lives than it was really about suicide for me. It was more about suicide for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
We do have some questions.
Yeah.
One is, what was the most painful part of writing this book? Since we're in the painful part.
Well, I'll tell you, earlier I said, oh, it's a lot like writing a novel, but I've never cried while writing a novel.
Oh.
When I first started writing this, and I remember the first day I actually began. I was at McDowell, which is a writer's thing in New Hampshire, and I was sitting in bed with my laptop and entering in through language into these lives. And I started crying, and I had never had that experience before. So I would say giving myself the license to do what I did, even while living in the doubt of whether I should or not, was the hardest part.
Yeah. You talk about how it was a very difficult decision to even read the journals, but you don't talk so much about the decision to write it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have to say, I want to get to all the questions, but there's so much I left out of this book.
Yeah.
There's so much. I could write another book, and I think about it. I play with the idea sometimes. I'm not, but when you have 1,000 pages of journals, and you have a lifetime with somebody, there's a lot.
Yeah. Somebody asked, what was the greatest gift you found in reading the journals, besides the obvious that you were able to reconcile the man who had abandoned Holly with the man who you had known before then?
Mm-hmm. The I think the thing that Holly was struggling with when you saw her, and what so many survivors of suicide struggle with, is why. And even when they're notes, they don't explain. Most of them, not most, but many of them say, I'm a burden to you. I'm going to get out of the way. And that doesn't make any sense to us. So it remains a mystery sometimes, and maybe even usually forever. And what I felt like that I was able to do through this access I had to his life as I knew him, the man that I knew, and then this incredibly deeper dive into the darker person inside, and putting the two together, I was able to understand or explain, at least again, it's a memoir, it's from my perspective, but at least explain to me why he ended up where he was. And even though he left 25 pages of suicide notes, as you're not surprised, of course, I my final observations did not coincide exactly with what his explanation was. So I think that was understanding somebody that way was the greatest gift.
Had you ever thought of writing a memoir before? Had you ever planned one?
Never. No, it was, I mean, what would I write about? You know, one of the most difficult parts of writing this memoir is William was so much more interesting than me. Now, I'm a writer. There's nobody more boring than a writer. Who wants to know what a writer thinks or does? Because I go into a room, the best possible day is I write, and then I come out of the room and I have a glass of wine. That's just not interesting. But I had to insert myself into this book in a way that was interesting. And talking about myself is difficult. I don't like to talk about myself. So the idea of a memoir was off-putting at best.
Well, I have to say, you talk extremely well and openly about yourself. And my wife is fond of quoting Flannery O'Connor, who said that anybody who has survived childhood has material for a lifetime of books. And there appeared to me to be a lot of kind of self-reflection about who you were at 12, at 14, at 17, at 20, at 25, and at 30. And I would imagine that that was interesting too to you as you wrote it.
Absolutely. I always thought people who wrote memoirs, they were really just typing up the story of their life. But what it is an investigation of your life that I never would have done if it hadn't been for this. So I did end up learning a lot about me at the same time.
Is there anything else you want to read or anything I haven't asked you that, or something you want to talk about? Or should we, by the way, should we mention suicide hotlines? Because probably there are people who are interested.
Absolutely. And I have this in the beginning of the book. There's a 3-digit dialing code 988 that'll route callers directly to the suicide prevention lifeline. You can also text 741-741 to be connected with a trained counselor. The 800 number is 273-8255. And one reason, it's obvious why these are so important, but the other thing that I've learned from this whole experience, writing about William, reading his journals, is that when you have a secret, like the desire to take your own life, and you keep it, which most people do, that it becomes bigger and bigger, and then it becomes completely overwhelming. If you are able to share that with somebody else, it diminishes the power of that secret. And so you're less likely to do that. So telling people who you are, talking about yourself with people, how you feel, I think is one of the best ways to prevent suicide.
I like to, it's an extreme version of we complain in order to rid ourselves of the complaint.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you both. What an incredible conversation. I'm so glad you brought up that at the end, and how showing the things you're most scared of showing people is really a way to help start healing and accepting yourself. I mean, that was so strong in the book. And it also was something that you brought to people that are struggling with themselves. You coming around with your open heart instead of seeking closure, but seeking openness and healing. you really let a lot of people know that they can also share those dark parts of themselves. So really, thank you for sharing that today. Thank you for your conversation. This was really remarkable. Thank you, Neal. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you to everybody that was here and tuned in today. We hope you have a great rest of your day and look forward to seeing you at another one of our events in the future.
Thank you so much.